Hello. So I went and talked about the fact that I got this book on Twitter. I've also, while it's not a physical copy of Custom Reality and You, I do have it, or I have a PDF of it given to me by Peter Coffin himself. So that will also be done in the same format as this book club here. So ANTIFA, the Anti-Fascist Handbook by Mark Bray. So I've read the first few chapters on my own already, but I figured that, I would read it out and, maybe stop a bit here and there. Um, I'm probably not going to have the camera the whole time, but just in case you want to know, I am reading it from a paperback copy. So it is a physical copy. And also, I have a stream tomorrow for my birthday. So, um, just before we get started, try and keep the chat as little cluttered up as possible, but maybe, some discussion points you want to talk about. I'll get to them during the intermissions as much as I can. Um, and, I don't really know how the intermissions are going to go. I've never really done something like this. And so, you might have to bear with me a bit. But, I'm going to turn my camera off and we can get started. So, I figured today we're going to start with the introduction and we're just going to start with the introduction today. Um, so, the introduction isn't that long. It isn't going to be as long as other chapters that we cover. This one, the stream might only be about half an hour as compared to, an hour that another chapter might take. So let's get started with the introduction of the book. Of course, when you open it up, you get a Derudi quote. Fascism is not to be debated, it is to be destroyed. Couldn't agree to that one more, even if I wanted to. So, introduction. I wish there was no need for this book, but someone burned down the Victoria Islamic Center in Victoria, Texas, hours after the announcement of the Trump administration's Muslim ban, and weeks after a flurry of more than 100 proposed anti-LGBTQ laws in early 2017. A man smashed through the front door of Casa Ruby, a Washington, D.C. transgender advocacy center, and assaulted a trans woman as he shouted, "I'm gonna kill you, faggot!" A day after Donald Trump's election, Latino students at Royal Oak Middle School in Michigan were brought to tears by their classmates' chants of "Build the wall," or "Build that wall." Sorry, correction on that. And then in March, a white supremacist army veteran who had taken a bus to New York to target black males stabbed a homeless black man named Timothy Kaufman to death. That same month, a dozen tombstones were toppled and defaced in the Wad. I apologize, by the way, for any mispronunciations. Wad Hakalel Jewish Cemetery in Rochester, New York. Among those resting in peace in Wad, in Wad, I feel so bad for anybody who is watching this. Hakalel is my grandmother's cousin, Ida Bryman, who was fatally shot by an employer months after she arrived in the United States from Ukraine as she stood on a picket line with other immigrant Jewish garment workers in 1913. The recent spate of Jewish cemetery desecrations in Brooklyn, Philadelphia, and elsewhere occurred under the Trump administration, whose statement on the Holocaust omitted any reference to Jews, whose press secretary denied that Hitler gassed anyone, and whose chief advisor was one of the most prominent figures of notoriously anti-Semitic alt-right. As So, of course, we already see some references, or there's already a reference to Sean Spicer in there. Um, you know, the Holocaust, or no, it was Holocaust camps, or no, Holocaust centers, or I think that's what it's a reference to. Um, a lot of crazy shit going on with the Trump administration. So let's keep going. As Walter Benjamin wrote fuck, I feel really bad for this because I'm bad at reading aloud. I'm sure I'll get better. I've had to memorize scripts before, so I think I can manage. It's just that this is live, and I suck live. But anyway, enough about me. So, as Walter Benjamin wrote, at the apogee of interwar fascism, even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins. Despite a resurgence of white supremacist and fascistic violence across Europe and the United States, most consider the dead and living to be safe because they believe fascism to be safely dead. In their eyes, the fascist enemy lost definitively in 1945. But the dead were not safe when Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi. Fucking, I'm Italian and I can't even pronounce Italian shit. Berlusconi described spending time in Mussolini's prison camps as a vacation in 2003. Or the French National Front politician Jean-Marie Le Pen called Nazi gas chambers a mere detail of history in 2015. So there we go. We've got more comparisons with a lot of the fascistic politics going on these days. Luckily Le Pen lost the election. Of course, we got a neoliberal instead, which isn't much better. A detail of history in 2015. Neo-Nazis who in recent years have littered the sites of former Jewish ghettos in Warsaw and other Polish cities with white power graffiti know very well how their Celtic crosses target the dead as well as the living. The Haitian anthropologist Michael Rolf Truitt. Fuck, I wish I knew how to pronounce these names. I feel bad. Cautions us that the past does not exist independently from the present. The past, or more accurately, pastness, is a position. Thus, in no way can we identify the past as past. This book takes seriously the transhistorical terror of fascism and the power of conjuring the dead when fighting back. It is an unabashedly partisan call to arms that aims to equip a new generation of anti-fascists with the history and theory necessary to defeat the resurgent far right based on 61 interviews with current and former anti-fascists from 17 countries in North America and Europe. It expands our geopolitical and temporal outlook to contextualize opposition to Trump and the alt-right within a much wider, broader terrain of resistance. Antifa is the first transnational history of post-war anti-fascism in English and the most comprehensive in any language. It argues that militant anti-fascism is a reasonable, historically informed response to the fascist threat that persisted after 1945 and that has become especially menacing in recent years. You may not walk away from this book being a convinced anti-fascist, but at least you will understand that anti-fascism is a legitimate political tradition growing out of a century of global struggle. So far, it seems pretty accurate. Of course, this is about why this book exists. Before analyzing what is anti-fascism? Before analyzing anti-fascism, we must first briefly examine fascism. More than perhaps any other mode of politics, fascism is notoriously difficult to pin down. The challenge of defining fascism stems from the fact that it began as a charismatic movement united by an experience of faith in direct opposition to rationality and the standard constraints of ideological precision. Mussolini explained that his movement did not feel tied to any particular doctrinal form. Our myth is the nation, he asserted, and to this myth, to this grandeur, we subordinate all the rest. As historian Robert Paxton argued, fascists reject any universal value other than the success of chosen peoples in a Darwinian struggle for primacy. Even the party platforms that fascists put forward between the world wars were usually twisted or jettisoned entirely when the exigencies of the pursuit of power made those interwar fascists uneasy bedfellows with traditional conservatives. Left fascist rhetoric about defending the working class against the capitalist elite was often among the first of their values to be discarded. Post-war, after World War II, fascists have experimented with an even more dizzying array of positions by freely pilfering from Maoism, anarchism, Trotskyism, and other left-wing ideologies and cloaking themselves in respectable electoral guises in the model of France's Front National and other parties. I agree with Angelo Tasca's argument that to understand fascism, we must write its history. Yet, since that history will not be written here, a definition will have to suffice. Paxton defines fascism as a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalists, militants, working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites, abandons democratic liberties and pursues the redemptive violence without ethical or legal restraints, goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. When compared to the challenges of defining fascism, getting a handle on anti-fascism may seem like an easy task at first glance. After all, literally, it is simply opposition to fascism. Some historians have used this literal minimalist definition to describe as anti-fascist a wide variety of historical actors, including liberals, conservatives, and others who combated fascist regimes prior to 1945. Yet the reduction of the term to a mere negation obscures an understanding of anti-fascism as a method of politics, a locus of individual and group self-identification, and a transnational movement that adapted pre-existing socialists, anarchists, and communist currents to a sudden need to react to the fascist menace. This political interpretation transcends the flattening dynamic of reducing anti-fascism to simple negation of fascism by highlighting the strategic, cultural, and ideological foundation from which socialists of all stripes had fought back. Yet even within the left, debates have raged between many socialists and communist parties, anti-racist NGOs, and others who have advocated a legalistic pursuit of anti-racist or anti-fascist legislation, and those who have defended a confrontational direct action strategy of disrupting fascist organizing. These two perspectives may not have always been mutually exclusive, and some anti-fascists have turned to the latter option after the failure of the former. But in general, this strategic debate has divided leftist interpretations of anti-fascism. This book explores the origin and evolutions of a broad anti-fascist current that exists at the intersection of pan-socialist politics and direct action strategy. This tendency is often called radical anti-fascism in France, autonomous anti-fascism in Germany, and militant anti-fascism in the United States, the UK, and Italy. Among today's ANTIFA, the shorthand for anti-fascist in many languages, also in other places pronounced ANTIFA, just so that, just so that everybody knows that this Anglo knows that she's pronouncing it wrong, but yeah. At the heart of the anti-fascist outlook is the rejection of the classical liberal phrase incorrectly ascribed to Voltaire that I disapprove of what anti-fascists committed themselves to fighting the death and the ability of organized Nazis to say anything. Thus, anti-fascism is an illiberal politics of social revolutionism applied to fighting the far right. Not only literal fascists, as we will see, anti-fascists have accomplished this goal in a wide variety of ways, from singing over fascist speeches to occupying the sites of fascist meetings before they could set up, to sowing discord in their groups via infiltration, to breaking any veil of anonymity, to physically disrupting their newspaper sales, demonstrations, and other activities. Militant anti-fascists disagree with the pursuit of state bans against extremist politics because of their revolutionary anti-state politics and because such bans are more often used against the left than the right. Some Antifa groups are more Marxist, while others are more anarchism or anti-authoritarian. In the United States, most have been anarchist or anti-authoritarian since the emergence of modern Antifa under the name Anti-Racist Action, ARA, in the late 80s. To some extent, the predominance of one faction over the other can be discerned in the group flag logo. Whether the red flag is in front of the black or vice versa, or whether both flags are black. In other cases, one of the two flags can be substituted with the flag of a national liberation movement, or a black flag can be paired with a purple flag to represent feminist Antifa, or a pink flag for queer Antifa, etc. Despite such differences, the Antifa I interviewed agreed that such ideological differences are usually subsumed in more general strategic agreement on how to combat the common enemy. Sorry, give me a second. Oh, I gotta catch my breath a little bit. It seems that Mark Bray has a bit of an understanding of anti-fascism. And definitely understands the historical tradition from which it comes from. All right. So, a range of tendencies exist within that broader strategic consensus. However, some Antifa focus on destroying fascist organizings, others focus on building popular community power and inoculating society to fascism through promoting their leftist political vision. Many formations fall somewhere in the middle of this spectrum. In Germany in the 1990s, a debate emerged in the autonomous anti-fascist movement over whether Antifa was mainly a form of self-defense necessitated by attacks from the far right, or a holistic politics often called to the broader revolutionary struggle, depending on local context and politics. Antifa can variously be described as a kind of ideology, an identity, a tendency, or milieu. I hope that I'm pronouncing that right, or an activity of self-defense. Despite the various shades of interpretation, Antifa should not be understood as a single-issue movement. Instead, it is simply one of a number of manifestations of revolutionary socialist politics. Broadly construed, most of the anti-fascists I interviewed also spend a great deal of their time on other forms of politics, e.g. labor organizing, squatting, environmental activism, anti-war mobilization, or migrant solidarity work. In fact, the vast majority would rather devote their time to these productive activities than have to risk their safety and well-being to confront dangerous neo-Nazis and white supremacists. Antifa act out of collective self-defense. The success or failure of militant anti-fascist often depend anti-fascism. I can't pronounce shit, apparently. Often depends on whether it can mobilize broader society to confront fascists, as occurred so famously with London's 1936 Battle of Cable Street, or tap into wider societal opposition to fascism to ostracize emerging groups and leaders. At the core of this complex process of opinion making is the construction of societal taboos against racism, sexism, homophobia, and other forms of oppression that constitute the bedrocks of fascism. These taboos are maintained through a dynamic that I call everyday anti-fascism. Chapter 6. It's the name of the chapter. Finally, it is important not to lose sight of the fact that anti-fascism has always been just one facet of a larger struggle against white supremacy and authoritarianism. In his legendary 1950 essay, Discourse and Colonialism, the Martiniquan writer and theorist Aimé Césaire, I don't feel really bad. I don't know how to pronounce these names. I'm so white, can't you tell? Argued convincingly that Hitlerism was abhorrent to Europeans because of its humiliation of the white man, and the fact that Hitler applied to Europe colonialist procedures, which until then had been reversed exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the N-words of Africa. I didn't use the word, but it does say it in there, just for a warning for anybody who wants to read the book. Without in any way diminishing the horrors of the Holocaust, to a certain extent, we can understand Nazism as European colonialism and imperialism brought home. The decimation of the indigenous populations of Americas and Australia, and tens of millions who died of famine in India under British rule, and 10 millions killed by Belgian King Leopold's Congo Free State. And the horrors of transatlantic slavery are but a sliver of the mass death and societal discrimination brought by European powers prior to the rise of Hitler. Early concentration camps, known as reservations, were set up by the American government to imprison indigenous populations, by the Spanish monarchy to contain Cuban revolutionaries in the 1890s, and by the British during the Boer War at the turn of the century, well before the Holocaust. The German government had committed genocide against the Herero and Nama people of Southwest Africa through the use of concentration camps and other methods between 1904 and 1907. For this reason, it is vital to understand anti-fascism as a solitary component of a larger legacy of resistance to white supremacy in all its forms. My focus on militant anti-fascism is in no way intended to minimize the importance of other forms of anti-racist organizing that identify with anti-imperialism, black nationalism, or other traditions. Rather than imposing an anti-fascist framework on groups and movements that conceive of themselves differently, even if they are battling the same enemies using similar methods, I focus largely on groups that self-consciously situate themselves within the anti-fascist tradition. So far, so good. Am I right? All right. Since World War II has become the emblematic moral drama of the Western world, historical anti-fascism has managed to accrue a certain degree of legitimacy, despite being overshadowed by the definitive role of the Allied armies in defeating the Axis powers. Still, with the defeat of Hitler and Mussolini, anti-fascism's reason d'etre, God damn it. I know ContraPoints literally pronounced this in one of her videos, but was widely thought to have evaporated. To some extent, this dismissal of anti-fascism grew out of the Western tendency to interpret fascism as an extreme form of evil, to which anyone who let down their moral guard could be subject, as opposed to the similarly distorted Soviet bloc interpretation of fascism as the terroristic dictatorship of the most reactionary elements of finance capital. After 1945 was enshrined as a terminal break with an aberrant period of barbarism, this individualistic moral interpretation of fascism discounted the need for political movements to vigilantly oppose far-right organizing. In other words, once fascism was understood almost entirely in apolitical and moral terms, any semblance of continuity between far-right politics and opposition to it over the time was rejected. History is a complex tapestry stitched together by threads of continuity and discontinuity. Elements of continuity are emphasized when they serve established interests. The nation is eternal, gender is unchanging, hierarchy is natural, yet elements of discontinuity are emphasized in the popular memory of social struggle. Once social movements and their leading figures gain enough power to establish their legitimacy, their historical legacies are shorn of their radical tendencies and embalmed in an ahistorical decontextualizing formaldehyde. For example, as an Occupy Wall Street organizer in New York, I found it a struggle to explain to journalists how the movement was just an extension of the politics and practices of the global justice movement, feminist movement, anti-nuclear movement, and others. One of the most momentous achievements of Black Lives Matter has been the degree to which its organizers have succeeded in connecting their struggles to the movements for Black liberation of the 1960s and 70s. Of all recent social struggles, anti-fascism faces perhaps the most difficult road towards establishing itself as an extension of over a century of struggle against white supremacy, patriarchy, and authoritarianism. Anti-fascism is many things, perhaps most fundamentally, it is an argument about the historical continuity between different eras of far-right violence and the many forms of collective self-defense that it has necessitated across the globe over the past century. That is not to say, however, that the past century of anti-fascism has been uniform. Interwar anti-fascism differed in important ways from the Antifa groups that developed decades later. As I explore in Chapter 1, given the magnitude of the fascist threat, interwar anti-fascism was far more popular, in part that it stemmed from a stronger connection between militant anti-fascism and the institutional left prior to 1945, as compared to the antagonism between the more countercultural Antifa of the 1980s and 1990s and official governmental anti-fascism. As we will see, the strategies and tactics of post-war Antifa, explored in Chapter 2, have been largely calibrated to potentially resurgent fascist organizing rather than ascendant mass parties. Cultural shifts and advances in communications technologies have altered how anti-fascists organize and how they present themselves to the world. On a material and cultural level, anti-fascism functioned and appeared differently in 1936 than it did in 1996. Yet the anti-fascist commitment to stomp out fascism by any means necessary connects the Italian Arditi del Popolo of the early 1920s with the anarchist skinhead kickboxers of today. Of course, talking about Sharp. This element of continuity sustains modern anti-fascism over the past decades, have self-consciously adopted interwar anti-fascist symbols like the two flags of Antifasciste Action, the three arrows of the Iron Front, and the raised fist salute. A young rash, red and anarchist skinhead named Jorg from Munich, explained to me how he is constantly inspired by memories of resistance figures like Hans Beimler, Sophie Scholl, and Jorg Elser that haunt his city streets. One cannot even pass by an Antifa demonstration in Madrid without hearing the 1930s slogan "No Parasan," they shall not pass, and Madrid will be the tomb of fascism. The Italian partisan organization ANPI reaffirmed the continuity when it included David Dax. This is David Dax Caesar. Fuck, oh, these names are gonna kill me because I do not know how to pronounce any of them. Among its anti-fascist martyrs, after he was killed by neo-Nazis in 2003, the slogan "Never Again" requires us to recognize that if we're not vigilant, it could happen again. Preventing that from happening, anti-fascists argue, requires us to break anti-fascism out of its historical cage so that its wings can spread out across time and space. By the way, you're going to see me like stop on paragraphs sometimes because, I have a Kindle and I have to open up my Kindle again so that it doesn't boot me out of the stream while the screen is off. Historians have played their role in cementing the divide between the heroic anti-fascism of the interwar period and the trivial, marginal Antifa groups of recent decades. Apart from a few works on the British anti-fascism in the 1970s and 80s, professional historians have written next to nothing in English on post-war developments. The overwhelming majority of studies on post-war anti-fascism have focused on questions of historical memory and commemoration, thereby implicitly reinforcing the tendency to relegate struggles against fascism to the past. While there is a relatively ample body of German language literature on anti-fascism in post-war Germany and a handful of national studies and academics, theses. You can't see the gesture I'm making, but it would be really funny if you could. Because it was just the realization that I do not know how to read, that my dyslexia just fucking threw me for a loop. All right, now to find my place back. It was at the end of a sentence. Oh, wait. Thereby implicitly yep. While there is a relatively ample body of German language literature on anti-fascism in post-war Germany, and a handful of national studies and academic theses on anti-fascism in France, Sweden, and Norway in their respective languages. To my knowledge, the only other book on transnational post-war anti-fascism was published in Italian. ANTIFA, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, is therefore the first book to trace the broad contours of transnational post-war anti-fascism in English and the most comprehensive in its chronological range and scope of national examples in any language. Given the dearth of information on post-war anti-fascism, I have been forced to rely primarily on articles and accounts from the mainstream and the anti-fascist press and interviews with current and former anti-fascists. One reason why such studies have not materialized in the past is the general reluctance of anti-fascists to risk exposing their identities publicly by speaking with journalists or academics. Most militant anti-fascists operate in various degrees of secrecy to protect themselves from fascist and police backlash. My ability to conduct interviews with North American and European anti-fascists was entirely reliant upon the relationships I had established over more than 15 years of organizing. My radical credentials allowed me to tap into anti-fascist networks to speak, often under conditions of anonymity, with 61 anti-fascists, 26 from 16 U.S. states, and 35 active in Canada, Spain, the UK, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, Poland, Russia, Greece, Serbia, and Kurdistan. I also interviewed 8 historians, activists, former football hooligans, and others from the United States and Europe about anti-fascism in their countries. All translations are my own unless otherwise noted, yet I do not make any claims towards this being comprehensive or definitive history, being a comprehensive or definitive history of anti-fascism in general, nor of the development of national movements in particular to the degree that it is a history at all. It is an impressionistic history that aims to concisely trait these broad themes and developments through weaving together vignettes from 17 different countries over more than a century. This more modest goal was necessitated not only by the relative lack of sources and scholarly works, but by a tight deadline. This book was researched and written over a relatively short period in order to make its contributions available as soon as possible amid the tumultuous climate of the early Trump era. Therefore, the book is an example of history, politics, theory on the run. It prioritizes the immediate need to make available insights and experience from current and former anti-fascists from 2 continents over waiting years. For more expansive studies, such works are, of course, vitally necessary, and hopefully many will be written in the future that will greatly eclipse what this book has to offer. Although historians usually attempt to preserve at least a facade of neutrality when analyzing their historical subjects, I agree with historian Dave Renton that one cannot be balanced when writing about fascism. There is nothing positive to be said about it. We should be warier of those who are truly neutral towards fascism than those who honestly espouse their opposition to racism, genocide, and tyranny. Because of time constraints, I had to limit the book to the United States, Canada, and Europe. It is important to emphasize that anti-fascism has played a crucial role in struggles around the world over the past century. Anti-fascists from around the world journeyed to Spain to fight the international brigades. Today, there are Antifa groups across Latin America, East Asia, Australia, and elsewhere. My choice to omit serious considerations of these groups should not be interpreted as as a slight, but rather as a lamentable necessity given a lack of time and the fact that as a historian of modern Europe, I turned towards the knowledge and context I had already established. Moreover, my treatment of Europe leans heavily toward Western and Central Europe, despite the fact that some of the most intense anti-fascist struggles of recent years have occurred in the East. Once again, this simply reflects the fact that I have more contacts in Western Europe, and the information that exists on Eastern European anti-fascism in English is fragmentary. Finally, I focus on anti-fascism when fascist or fascistic regimes are not in power, i.e. Italy before about 1926, Germany before 1933, Spain before 1939, etc. Obviously, the partisan resistance of the 1940s and the guerrilla opposition to Franco over the following decades were the epitome of anti-fascism and are certainly worthy of study given limits of time and space. I prioritized analyzing anti-fascism in its preventative stage. That is, when fascism does not have full force of the state behind it, because that is the situation readers find themselves in today. I regret these constraints and reiterate that hopefully future works will feature more expansive frameworks. Europe and the United States have witnessed an alarming lurch to the right over recent years in response to the 2008 economic crisis, austerity measures, the strains of an increasingly post-industrial economy, cultural and demographic shifts, migration, and the arrival of refugees fleeing the Syrian civil war, referred to as the refugee crisis by the European right. These factors have fueled the rise of respectable far-right parties such as the French Front National, the Dutch Party for Freedom, and the Austrian Freedom Party. and xenophobic formations like Germany's patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the West, known as Pegida or Pegida. Chapter 3 discusses their rise and the challenges they have posed for Antifa organizing. In the same chapter in the same chapter, I discuss the development of the alt-right, alternative right, and the spark far-right politics received from Donald Trump's successful 2016 bid for the American presidency. In just the first 34 days after his election, more than 1,094 bias incidents were reported, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. It's only one center, not multiple. Hate crimes increased by 94% in New York City over the first 2 months of 2017, compared to the same period in 2016, more than half of which were committed against Jews. Mosques in Texas, Florida, and elsewhere have been set on fire. These attacks grew out of a rise in the number of hate groups, specifically anti-Muslim groups, and unprecedented outreach efforts by white supremacists to recruit on college campuses. And the list goes on. While eradicating this reactionary hatred will require organizing on all fronts to project an alternative revolutionary vision, in the short term, anti-fascists are among those most committed to weeding out racists, anti-Semites, and Islamophobes, as Montreal ARA founder Walter Tull phrased it. The job of the anti-fascist is to make fascists too afraid to act publicly and act as volunteer targets for their hate and attacks, which might keep them from thinking about burning down the mosque in their neighborhood. I subtitled the work The Anti-Fascist Handbook because it is a relatively brief, hopefully useful reference book intended to promote organizing against fascism, white supremacy, and all forms of domination. It is up to the reader to determine the practical utility of this work, but at the very least, 50% of author proceeds will go to the International Anti-Fascist Defense Fund, which is administered by more than 300 Antifa from 18 countries. After choosing the subtitle, I learned that the London Gay Activist Alliance wrote a pamphlet called An Anti-Fascist Handbook in 1979 amid the terror of the National Front. Antifa intends to carry the legacy of such practically informed anti-fascist writing forward toward the publication of even more anti-fascist handbooks in the future. I hope Antifa will aid and inspire those who will take up the fight against fascism in the years to come, so that someday there will be no need for this book. And all I have to say, rereading the introduction, is wow. I think there's a bit of jargon in there, and I'm going to check the comments now. I ended up reading the whole thing because I didn't really know where to do the intermissions. Oh. All right. Nobody have anything to talk about? Oh, wait. There we go. No, I guess that the reading should be fine then. Oh, yeah, it's just playing back at me. All right. Hopefully next time there can be a bit more engagement. I hope that everybody enjoyed that. Tomorrow I have a stream to celebrate my birthday, and this was definitely a fun thing to do. I can't wait to do more for this series. And anybody who watches this this archived stream, please leave a comment about what you think about my reading. I know that it could be better. I'm not good at live reading. I can do recording and takes just fine, but trying to read live, make mistakes. So you got to hear all my mistakes and shit live. So yeah, leave your comments. But I'm done for now.